Let's kill businesses. Let's all go around and hop on our bicycle and go down the crowded streets that are just absolute insanity right now on Bloor, on Yonge, on University. No.
The Premier of Canada's most populous province has doubled down on his anti-cycling rhetoric, promising to remove existing bike lanes on primary roads. He singled out 3 important routes that had been major wins for cycling in Toronto: Bloor Street, Yonge Street, and University Avenue. We lived in Toronto for half a decade, and we can actually credit the new Bloor Street bike lanes in 2016 for helping us get comfortable with urban cycling for transportation. In 2018, though, I came across the scene of a mangled bike and a dead cyclist in a body bag on my routine bike commute to the University of Toronto using Bloor Street. The 58-year-old grandmother was killed here at the corner of Bloor and St. George under a flatbed truck. It was a major wake-up call to the dangers that cyclists still faced, and probably contributed to us getting into cycling advocacy and safe streets. Just within the past few months, Toronto installed a Dutch-style intersection design at the location to avoid deaths like that in the future. It's this infrastructure that Doug Ford is promising to rip out, so I hope you can understand why the topic feels a little personal. His major complaint with bike lanes is that they cause congestion for the majority of road users, drivers, in order to appease a tiny minority. The 1.2% of people who commute by bike shouldn't be clogging primary roads for the over 70% of people who drive, explained his transportation minister. If we're talking about the city of Toronto, those numbers are a little off. It's 2% that commute by bike versus 61% that commute by car. But he also misses something much bigger. Of course Toronto doesn't have a ton of cycling relative to driving. It doesn't have much bike infrastructure relative to car infrastructure. Here's a map from the city of all the dedicated bikeways in Toronto. This includes not just protected bike lanes or cycle tracks, but also lower quality painted infrastructure. The area around downtown has a pretty decent network, but much of the rest of the city is a bike infrastructure desert, even after you add multi-use pathways, some of which are more useful for transportation than others. Let's zoom in on Etobicoke North, where Doug Ford represents. Aside from some nice recreational pathways along the Humber River, there's very little bike infrastructure. It's the same story in most of Toronto's inner suburbs like Scarborough and North York. Is it supposed to be a slam dunk argument against cycling, that not a lot of people bike in a city where the bike network looks like this? Some people have complained that the new western sections of Bloor Street aren't as well used as the older central sections. Might that be because the central sections exist within a network with many connections, while the newer sections are at the edge of the connected network? If you look at the part of the city with the most developed network, roughly between High Park and the Don Valley or a little further, you see much higher rates of cycling. Census tracts here in the 2021 census are mostly above 5% bike commuting, often above 10%, and a few are even above 15%. This isn't representative of the city, but it suggests what you can achieve with decent infrastructure, and it can almost definitely go higher. There are still lots of gaps in lower quality routes. Even around downtown, cyclists don't get nearly as many route options as drivers. Cycling critics often lack basic knowledge and experience with the bike network. A letter to the editor praising Doug Ford grumbled about rarely seeing cyclists on the new Eglinton bike lanes. But these cycle tracks are incomplete. Portions were installed in front of crosstown LRT stations, the orange on the map here, and the city has to fill in the rest. That's the teal sections on the map. They're literally complaining about low bike volumes on a route that's not finished yet. Not to mention that it's lacking the planned future cycling connections that it needs to meet its full potential. At least the last time I rode them, Doug Ford's dreaded Yonge Street bike lanes don't even connect up to Eglinton. There's an 800-meter gap. Driving wouldn't be nearly as common if segments of roads for cars didn't actually connect to each other. Doug Ford does this same thing when he talks about only 1 or 2% bike commuters, without knowing or caring that this is in the context of a bike network that's in its early stages, particularly in the more suburban parts of the city. All of this is circular. In much of the city, there's no bike infrastructure, so people don't bike. So we don't need bike infrastructure. The letter to the editor talked about rarely seeing cyclists on Eglinton, but went on to say, I do see quite a few food delivery cyclists electrified on the bike paths. I do see dangerous riding. I'm not sure why delivery riders don't count as cyclists, but they're very common in Toronto. And they're one group that's going to be out there making a living regardless of the infrastructure. If you've ever ordered Uber Eats, you owe them some consideration and care. Doug Ford focuses on congestion and travel time for drivers, but we also need to think about providing a baseline level of safe infrastructure. Nobody questions the number of people who walk on Eglinton, even in more suburban sections, and suggests that we eliminate sidewalks for more car lanes to speed up traffic. At least not yet. That letter to the editor did suggest that the sidewalks on Eglinton are too wide. The 3 bike routes that Doug Ford set his sights on to remove, Bloor, Yonge, and University, all happen to have frequent subway lines running underneath them, which means that with the bike lanes they become some of the most accessible streets in the country, reachable by transit, bike, car, and foot. Doug Ford has suggested that after ripping out bike lanes here, they can be replaced with alternate side street routes. Like we covered in another video, side street bike lanes can be fine, but Toronto isn't well suited to them. Just try to find a side street following Yonge or Bloor for any long distance. They don't really exist. If side streets really worked well as through routes, why couldn't you also alleviate congestion by sending some car traffic down them? Most of the numbers used in this debate have come from census data on commuting, which is a useful but incomplete picture of cycling. It doesn't capture non-work trips like groceries or appointments, and it doesn't count any trips by people under the age of 15. It's also a snapshot from 2021 during the pandemic. We know that bike-share TO continues to expand and break records, with 2024 seeing likely double the ridership of 2021. Some of those riders are using a bike for a full journey, but a lot of them are biking to a transit station. The census also doesn't count people who'd like to ride or ride more. A City of Toronto survey found that a large majority of people, even in the suburbs, want to travel more by bike than they do now. No, Toronto isn't yet a cycling city like Copenhagen or Amsterdam, but it's been making clear progress in that direction. The network has been expanding and getting upgraded to some really nice quality infrastructure. Toronto as a city and a region is growing a lot, and for political reasons, a lot of that growth is concentrated along primary roads like Yonge Street. The city has recognized that having everyone who moves in here drive is not a solution. The answer is more transit and cycling, and new apartments have increasingly been proposed and approved, with way more bike parking than car parking. This building on Bloor Street is proposed to have 61 car parking spots, versus 447 bike parking spots for 366 residences. This building on Yonge Street is proposed to have spots for just 2 cars but 171 bikes. Doug Ford's increasingly strong attacks on bike lanes are fundamentally at odds with geometry and the growth patterns of the city. So why is all this happening? Doug Ford is the Premier of Ontario, which is like the governor of a US state. Why is he trying to dictate street designs in Toronto as if he was the mayor? Well, these might or might not be the routes he personally takes from his home in the west of the city to the legislature downtown. He also used to be a city councillor in Toronto, and in 2014 he ran for mayor after his brother dropped out of the race for health reasons.
Rob Ford ended his run for mayor and brother Doug stepped into the race too late.
He lost, but he's had a fixation on the city as he moved up to provincial politics and even became the premier. He cut the size of Toronto City Council in half in the middle of the 2018 municipal election.
It is the most dysfunctional political arena in the country, City Hall.
Which he was able to do because, in Canada, cities are at the mercy of the provinces, constitutionally speaking. Unfortunately, he's been much more timid on overriding municipalities on housing reform, including refusing to legalize fourplexes province-wide, despite that being recommended by his own housing task force. The elephant in the room is that bike lanes have unfortunately become a flashpoint in the culture wars. Doug Ford represents a kind of suburban conservative populism that's defensive about cars, and hostile to bikes as a perceived representation of the downtown left-wing elites. The National Post leans into this hard, supporting Ford and accusing the left of engaging in non-stop groaning, complaining, and whining about saving their beloved bike lanes from the big bad Ontario Premier. This is not only childish, but also unnecessary. Why exactly are bike lanes left-coded? There's the environmental side, okay. But what about choice in transportation? Physical health? Saving money and living within your means? Family-friendly neighborhoods where you can bike your kids to school? Are Ontario Conservatives going to cede all of that to the left? A lot of the culture wars over transportation feel so arbitrary. This also comes in the context of Ford deciding to send out $200 checks to every Ontario resident.
These are tax dollars going back to the taxpayers.
A populous sign that he's in campaign mode and planning to call an election. We might hope that all of this was just election bluster, but they've actually proposed Bill 212, the Reducing Gridlock, Saving You Time Act. It sets up a review process for existing bike lanes, and would require provincial approval for new bike lanes that take space from cars. This heavy-handed approach could halt cycling progress in the province, and even turn back the clocks by a decade. The bill doesn't even distinguish between main roads and side streets like Doug Ford said. All of them would require provincial approval, with the proposed bike lane being judged on whether it would unduly diminish the orderly movement of motor vehicle traffic. No mention of the movement or safety of cyclists. Just as I was finalizing this video, the provincial government updated the bill to specify that they will remove these 3 corridors: Bloor, Yonge, and University. This is way worse than I would ever expect, and I legitimately can't believe that I have to make this video. This isn't just cycling progress slowing down, it's actively going backwards and ripping out essential parts of the bike network. Some of them, like University Avenue, were seeing upgrades to really high-quality permanent concrete protected lanes. How can you rip this out? If you want to voice your opposition, public comment on the bill is open until the end of day on November 20th, 2024. While Doug Ford is clearly focused on Toronto here, the provisions actually apply elsewhere in Ontario too, from Ottawa to Kitchener-Waterloo. If we still lived in Ontario, we'd send in a paragraph or so mentioning points like, the provincial government shouldn't be adding red tape and bureaucracy to slow down local governments trying to increase transportation options. I use bike lanes every day and consider them essential transportation infrastructure like sidewalks. We need to think about guaranteeing safety and providing options for vulnerable road users, instead of just maximizing the number of cars on the road. When I drive, I would much rather cyclists be out of my way in their own bike lanes. Bike lanes support transit investments by making it easier to get to stations. On top of this, you can contact your city councillor by email, saying that you support safe bike infrastructure and would hope to see them speak out from their own position. Whew. Thanks for watching through to the end of the video. Don't forget to bike and subscribe, and a special thanks to our supporters on Patreon.